1.0. There was no NewsMorphosis 1.0, just like there was no DBase #1, if you recall. We made the name up. It signifies a change, a transformation in the way our society, including our society here in Honolulu, informs itself. And since an informed public is one of the foundations of our democracy, this is no trivial matter. It's worth studying. No one will deny the conventional media is declining. No one will deny the news is migrating to the net and rapidly. It's a work in progress, though, and nobody knows exactly what form it will take. We're here to find out the depth and breadth of the decline, its causes and effects. We're here to identify the 21st century technologies that are making and will make this transformation possible. We're here, more than that, to put our heads together on the challenges and pitfalls of the transformation and the business models that are likely to drive it. We want to hear and we want to share thoughts with you, thoughts we have not heard before. In the end, you know, in this regard, success is our only option. We have some amazing moderators, panelists, and keynotes, people who are not afraid to give you profound new ideas. When you walk out of here later today, we'd like you to have a new handle on the way news works and brings us together, the way it affects our society, the way we and our peers and progeny can learn to trust it. And of course, the way we can start making money again using news. In these times, that's no small task, but we're looking at nothing less than that. So we brought together world-class academicians, journalists, technology leaders from points both distant and local to explore the process. We'll draw from journalism, technology, psychology, sociology, law, political science, you name it. We want it all. We've had help in the effort. Our committee has included Susan Horowitz, Colin McDonald, Mary Fastenal, Bill Spencer, Dan Luke, Steve Petronic, Michelle Van Hessen, Chris Kaneda, Nathan Kam, Tess Stadeker, Jocelyn Collado, Nicole Horry, and Pono Shim. Thank you to you all, and to Pioneer Plaza and the new Plaza Club for all their help today. You can see some banners on the wall. Many thanks to our organizers and sponsors, Anthology Marketing Group, Enterprise Honolulu, the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum, the Hawaii Venture Capital Association, the Honolulu Advertiser, Olelo, and Akaku, you know, Community Television in Maui, Pacific New Media, the Public Relations Society of America, the Society of Professional Journalists, the School of Communications at Manoa, Tech Hui, and ThinkTech Hawaii. We love them all. First, we're going to hear from our Wakeup keynote, Avi Soifer, the beloved dean of our own hometown law school, the William S. Richardson School of Law at UH Manoa. He's not just an ordinary law school dean, he's Avi Soifer, a Yale constitutional scholar who in many ways has made this school a unique Hawaii Camelot. We're calling this wake-up call and keynote the role of news in a free society. Nothing less, and nothing could be more appropriate to get your analytical thinking started. Ready to wake up? Here's Avi Soifer.
Thank you very much, Jay. I have given keynotes before, but never wake-up keynotes, so I don't know. You look pretty wide awake as it is. I'm not sure what I'm doing here, but that was a very generous introduction, although the Kennedy Camelot lasts only 1,000 days, and I'm hoping for much more. I feel very lucky to be here. I suspect I'm here because of Jay's loyalty to his friends. You know the phrase, Semper Fidell. Thank you, Jay. I do feel very lucky and blessed to be in this community at this time. And I think it is also good fortune that we are all here. Somehow Jay predicted, I guess, all these events that would happen in terms of our newspapers, in terms of our television station news consolidation, and in terms of a much talked about and not much known about new model, Pierre. What is Pierre up to? So there's a lot going on, and somehow months ago they decided to hold this right now, and here we are. I want to talk a little bit about how I got here, I guess, which I'm not saying is typical. It is an example of being lucky or blessed, but it has something to do with media along the way. And then I want to talk about community, which I think is a very important part of what we are here to discuss today. And finally, I want to get to a First Amendment puzzler that, to me, is posed by the recent decision by the Supreme Court in January in the Citizens United case, which I know a lot of people talked about. It doesn't mean a lot of people have read. I have done that, and I may have something to add to the discussion. As Jay stressed change and newness, he was saying something very American. And de Tocqueville, almost 175 years ago, said if you took a newspaper away from an American, you take away his history. He thought we were a very ahistorical people, and he was right. But he also had some important things to say about newspapers. And when I say my involvement with media, it is particularly in the traditional medium of the newspaper that I want to share a little bit. When I was growing up and struggling to stay awake to listen to the adults argue, one of the ways in which you could tell the players without a scorecard was by what newspaper they read. Because in those days, in my own home, the newspapers were New York papers in English and in Yiddish. And it really mattered which one you read. It told a lot about you. And people in those days read more than one newspaper. And that was, I think, a very significant part of the discourse of that time. I grew up in a family that were news junkies, I guess, and still are. And so I have fond memories of spreading out the evening paper in Des Moines, Iowa, on the floor. There was a good paper, but there was a morning paper and an evening paper, and that too made a difference in the rhythms of the day. I was lucky enough to do high school and college journalism, and I got a job for the Chicago Sun-Times in the summer of 1968, a summer job. One of my proudest moments was that they offered me a regular job, because that was really a newspaper town, and that was really a newspaper. There were four major papers in Chicago at that point, and there were the old guys sitting on the bar stools who got the story right out of the movies. I don't know how they did it. It was amazing to watch. But it was a lively sense of a dedication to something beyond the bottom line. And we are today, of course, very concerned with the bottom line, but I think newspapers and media in general are inevitably, in our society, more important even than that. My wife made a movie about the Forward, the Yiddish newspaper, and the way in which it helped people learn about America, immigrants who didn't speak the language and didn't know the customs, at the same time that it reinforced some of their distinct customs. And that, too, is an important role for media. Was very important in Hawaii, of course, with that famously highest literacy rate among Hawaiians and all those newspapers in the late 19th century. I also, after law school, was lucky enough to work for the National ACLU one summer on the Progressive Magazine case, a case in which a prior restraint actually lasted for over 4 months and where the Supreme Court of the United States didn't take the case over a dissent by Justice White. So we say prior restraint, no, in the law we never have them or we hardly ever have them. Well, we do have them, and the reason that was placed by a district judge in Wisconsin was the fear that the H-bomb secret was about to be published. The secret of the H-bomb, it turns out, was that there is no secret of the H-bomb, and it had been discovered on the shelves at Los Alamos by an amateur the first day he was down there doing research. And the story itself was written by someone who was a journalist, not a scientist, and he just talked to scientists who told him the story. First, you need an A-bomb, by the way, so don't worry too much about the secret of the H-bomb. But I learned in the course of this series of blessings or great good fortune that there is complexity and nuance. And I think one of the things we face today is a shrinking sense, even among our law students, but certainly way beyond the law school, a shrinking sense of the importance of complexity. There are people who think that they can multitask and they're not nearly as good at it as they like to think. And they don't concentrate on the full story. So it's the instant news, it's the impression, it's the ersatz feedback loop. What do I mean by that? I mean that we have on television all the time and in other media as well, the poll being taken Do you think we should take out the pitcher in the next inning? What do you think the manager should do? 62% say yes, right? So people get used to a sort of navel gazing. Nothing turns on that. I don't think the manager tunes in to find out what the fans thought. But the same thing happens with more important matters. And so the navel gazing turns out to be the poll results, the focus group that isn't focused. And I think we have much too much reliance on that ersatz feedback loop. It is feedback of a certain sort, but it's not the kind of feedback we need or we should want. In other ways, of course, when we have 24-hour news all the time, we have a situation in which there is not time to reflect on the complexity. Now, the great dilemma, of course, is that the complexity we don't have enough time for the complexity. So what to do about that? Well, one thing is to recognize that we're not going to get anywhere just by luck or just by being blessed. I'm reminded of the happy coincidence of being here. A friend of mine who has much more faith than I do says that a coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. I don't believe that. I prefer the story about the poor guy who's living in a ramshackle hut and he prays vehemently that he win the lottery. Turns out he doesn't win the lottery, and soon he's homeless, and he's praying even more fervently to win the lottery. And finally, he is near desperation, and he prays one last time, and a voice from heaven says, "Meet me halfway, buy a ticket." So we have to, I think, buy a ticket into the past somewhat. I gave you my own little story. We all have those stories, I think, and we all have in those stories recognition that whatever is the newest and the most fashionable is not necessarily the most significant. So I want to quote a few other lines from Tocqueville. Tocqueville, of course, came as a young aristocrat from France to the United States and had remarkable insight and was quite a writer as well. He was an aristocrat who had all sorts of doubts about democracy. But one of the things he is most famous for was recognizing the importance of associations. And he said, these Americans have more associations than I can imagine, than I've ever seen anywhere. Why is this? And he went on to say that a newspaper is like an association. It is a community in its own way. To quote Tocqueville, "I shall not deny that in democratic countries, newspapers frequently lead the citizens to launch together into very ill-digested schemes. But if there were no newspapers, there would be no common activity. The evil which they produce is therefore much less than that which they cure." He talks about too much equality in his view, but equality in particular leads to the importance of associations and specifically of newspapers. These wandering minds, which had long sought each other in darkness, at length meet and unite. The newspaper brought them together, and the newspaper is still necessary to keep them united. A newspaper is an advisor that does not require to be sought, but that comes of its own accord and talks to you briefly every day of the commonweal without distracting you from your private affairs. The commonweal, the communal good. The media has had a tradition and has a responsibility still, I would submit, to emphasize that. And he says, "What best explains to me the enormous circulation of the daily press in the United States is that among the Americans I find the utmost national freedom combined with local freedom of every kind." Used to a centralized government in France, here he was seeing federalism, as we would call it. And because of federalism, because of the dispersion of power, we have the importance particularly of media. The people need it. They need the social conditions of men being more equal. They need it in particular in the United States. So we are facing a time when we may well have only one newspaper, and when we are having smaller and smaller bands of journalists trying to bring that complexity and nuance to the fore, whether it be in a newspaper or in a TV newsroom or in other media as well. What to do about it? Tom Brislin suggested to me that a model might be the volunteer fire department, that it may come to that. But there are still people who are so committed to the beyond the bottom line traditions of the media that they will from time to time gather and use their special skills. Some will be editors and some will be copy editors and others will be reporters. And they'll put something out together. So we would have them sort of on tap. There's a big story, you ring a bell or whatever, send an email, and they rally around, and like a volunteer fire department, they are trained to deal with that big moment. It's an interesting idea. It is said about the business model that everyone's abuzz about that it has to do with civic engagement and with the way in which civic engagement is still of value, particularly in this community. And I think that is true. So I have high hopes for that business model. It may be that people are actually willing to pay to participate while all the other people watch, and the advertisers see the people watching, the people participating have paid to get in, and as you all know, sometimes when you pay, something is more valuable than when you just let it slide by. So if people pay to participate, pay a nominal fee to participate in this civic engagement, we will have a phenomenon of civic engagement which may be paid for by the people who are addicted to the sports call-in shows, right? I mean, we know there are people who cannot resist saying, no, 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 Mays was the better center fielder. If they still talk about Mays and Mantle and Duke Snider. So those people may pay the freight, right? They just have to be heard on the sports line. But the civic engagement part would be particularly important, I think, in a community that is still a community, though melting pot is not the right image. As many of you know, there are many other images. Melting pot, after all, gets everything together. It doesn't actually have the separate parts, but it was meant in alchemy days to separate. So it's a kind of strange Central American metaphor. My late friend Kinji Kinozawa used to say, no, no, it's a crisp salad in Hawaii. And every ingredient retains its own flavor, and then all together makes for a much better mix. So I think he was onto something in saying so. My First Amendment puzzler. So as you all know, in Citizens United, the Supreme Court said that 100 years of bans or restrictions on campaign spending by corporations had to be struck down in the name of the First Amendment. It was not a surprise when the decision came down. The Supreme Court had put it on for re-argument and asked questions that were not part of the original case. When that happens, you know something is up. So we all knew it was sort of likely that they were going to strike down federal laws and by implication state laws as well. The way they did it, however, is particularly striking. And I want to spend a couple of minutes while you're waking up or going back to sleep, whichever is the case, in talking about First Amendment values, that case, and what I've called a puzzler. The First Amendment, I need not remind you, says the following: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Why do we so value freedom of expression? Why is this country set apart from virtually all others in our protection of freedom of expression? My late Professor Tom Emerson, the great First Amendment scholar of his generation, said there are 4 reasons. One of them is individual self-fulfillment, and this gets back to the Tocqueville point. De Tocqueville said, these Americans are all about individualism and equality among individuals, and Emerson doesn't reject that argument. He says that's right. We have the First Amendment in a particularly high place because of individual self-fulfillment. We believe in that, and being able to express oneself or to hear others express themselves is a part of that self-fulfillment. Another argument, a classic philosophical argument, is that the discovery of truth follows from free expression. The truth will out. With more and more debate, it is likely in the end that the truth will out. Whether or not you agree with that, at least some philosophers think that the truth does out over time. Third, democratic decision making. This is, of course, a very important role for the media because they are a checking function on government, the fourth estate. They are there in part to enable the citizens to know what's going on, to throw the bastards out if that's necessary, and finally to check government power. Federalism is one version of a check on power. The role of the media, the role of newspapers in Tocqueville's time is a check on governmental power. And fourth, a stable community. And this is a sort of ironic one, because Emerson said freedom of expression actually functions often as a safety valve. It lets people let off steam. Maybe it lets those in power know who the troublemakers are, even, to keep an eye on them. That isn't what he was arguing, but he says, for a stable community, you have to have that ability to sound off. And it is actually a sort of moderating influence to have a rugged and outspoken freedom of expression regimen. So, newspapers and media, we have this freedom of expression. These sound like pretty good arguments. The puzzler revolves around the special role for the press. Now, when I quoted the First Amendment, there are those words, or of the press. Do they mean that the press has more freedom of expression than the rest of us? It would seem to suggest more or different. And yet we don't have many Supreme Court decisions, or any other decisions for that matter, that turn on that distinction. We do have special privileges for the press, often defended as the press in role of surrogate. They are there on our behalf. So there is access to the courts, for example, for the press, and there are cases about this, that say, the press has a right to sit in the courtroom. You can't close the courtroom, and in fact, you can have special seats for the press. Everybody wants to get in. The press does get in, at least representatives of the press. So the press perhaps has additional constitutional protections to that of the rest of us. This leads to some problems. Who is the press, after all? And this is a particular problem in our times, with people blogging and otherwise carrying on and expressing their views forcefully, perhaps in a safety valve way, and so on up through the justifications I just tried to summarize. But we have reporters' privileges. We have an expansive reporters' privilege in Hawaii of recent vintage. So who counts as a reporter? Well, ironically, sometimes the press itself has to decide who gets the seats in the press gallery. And that's a way that we have avoided really confronting that issue in terms of constitutional law. Because we say, well, the press, that's private, it's an association or something, so we don't have to worry about the First Amendment applying. But I think we do have to worry about it, and we will increasingly have to worry about it. Here I am arguing on the one hand that the press has and should have special standing, and secondly, that we have some difficulties in figuring out who that is, who gets that special claim. So back to Citizens United. The argument that Justice Kennedy makes for the majority is that the source of expression doesn't matter. That seems to me inconsistent with what I just said. Now the argument here is because it's corporate speech, should not distinguish it from the speech of individuals. And he has some argument to be made based in particular on a weird case in the 1880s which said corporations are persons for purposes of the 14th Amendment. But corporations are persons for purposes of the 14th Amendment only some of the time. Now, corporations have a lot of advantages over the rest of us. They get to live forever, for example. It would be nice if we could incorporate and go on and on. They have some liability advantages and so on. So corporations do have advantages, but they don't have all the protections the rest of us do. If it comes to a search and seizure and so on, there are many differences. So why is it that corporations have the same right in terms of campaign financing? His argument is that the confidence and stability in civic discourse that the First Amendment must secure depends on this. Now, I think Justice Kennedy, a bit too much, sees himself writing for the ages. And he's gotten a little bit big-headed about being in the center of the court all the time, the crucial vote. So there are some wonderful phrases in this decision about freedom of expression. But it just cannot be, if you think about it, that it doesn't matter who the source of the expression is. And that's true at my law school, for example. There are places where students can say things and I can't, and vice versa. In a classroom, in any classroom, it matters who's speaking, whether it's the teacher or the student or the principal or whatever. And of course, we have many, many regulations, the FCC and on and on and on, where the source of the expression does matter. So it cannot be that this principle is as broad as Justice Kennedy seems to think. He doesn't like what the Congress had done, that's clear. He has to go through a number of recent precedents And so the sweeping nature of this case is what surprised a lot of observers, to say nothing of the inside baseball that wasn't played in the usual way. The question presented when the case came up to the Supreme Court is not what they decided on. There's a whole thing about on its face or as applied. I need not bore you with that, but it's important. And Justice Stevens, in his dissent, and I think it's sort of a valedictory, I think it almost tells us that he is indeed about to retire from the Supreme Court, really takes on what Justice Kennedy is saying point by point. Justice Scalia concurs with Justice Kennedy, and he says, though faced with a constitutional text that makes no distinction between types of speakers, the dissent feels it necessary, and so on. He says, there was no discrimination against corporations at the time of the First Amendment. Yeah, but there weren't many corporations. But I think, tried to indicate to you that the text does make a distinction, and the media is that distinction. So putting aside Citizens United, the puzzler is how much extra First Amendment protection should the press, should the media get? And I want to claim they should get a lot. They should get a lot because we need surrogates, because we cannot follow. We don't have time to follow. We can't get the complexity and the nuance. And the calling of a journalist is a higher calling. It is, I think, something to be said about, beyond the bottom line, about a tradition to be continued and not lost sight of. And finally, what Tocqueville said, newspapers become more necessary in proportion as men become more equal and individualism more to be feared. He wasn't talking about our time. He was talking about the United States in the 1830s, when there wasn't a hell of a lot of equality. Nonetheless, he said, to suppose that they only serve to protect freedom would be to diminish their importance. They maintain civilization. So we need our media. We need our civilization maintained. We need sometimes to go back to the future and not to be as ahistorical as we all tend to be. Thank you very much. Now you're entitled to go to sleep.
Thank you, Avi. We are here to maintain civilization today, at the least. Also, the notion of a volunteer fire department, watch that thread. I have a feeling that's going to come up again today. The notion of civic engagement, pay to play, there's another thread I think will come up again today. Thank you, Avi.